10, Big W, as you may have heard, has taken a sex education and consent book aimed at adolescents called Welcome to Sex off their shelves after staff members were abused. It's a tricky debate, isn't it? Critics believe the book is way too graphic. The other side claims that the book provides comprehensive and inclusive advice. But as parents, when and how should we talk about the subject with our kids? Or should schools take the lead? How should this process work? What's best practice? Dr. Julia Coffey is a senior lecturer in sociology at the University of Newcastle, and she's with us now. Julia, thanks for doing that, and good morning.
Good morning.
So, have you seen this book? I'm just interested in your observations about it and the process of having those kinds of instructional resources available through retail outlets.
Yeah, sure. Yes, I have seen it. And looking at the topics and reading about it, I haven't obviously got a copy of the book yet, but it certainly looks to me to line up with evidence-based best practice and agreed upon best practice in the relationships and sexuality education space, and also the kind of content that's agreed upon as being important, in medical establishment as well, with paediatricians. So this is very well established and well evidenced information. And as the authors say as well, it's based on the kinds of questions that they saw for decades through Dolly magazine, which was obviously one of the authors came from editing the Dolly Doctor section. That certainly was an important way that I got sexuality education when, don't want to say how long ago, but quite a while ago.
Yes.
So I think, the important thing to remember is that these are questions that young people have.
Yeah.
These, and learning about sex and having age-appropriate sex education that includes topics like consent, respect for relationships, as well as the kind of more anatomical aspects of it. It's all part of a much broader conversation that will happen throughout a child's and adolescent's life and throughout an adult's life. So I think that it's a really important thing for this book to be available, and that this kind of information is already available and being accessed in all kinds of different ways by children and adolescents. And I think having a well-evidenced, clear, age-appropriate way to communicate with young people is really important, because they will seek out answers from other places which may be unsafe, shall we say.
Julia, can we get to timing? And I guess it's a case-by-case
Sure.
thing. We'll know our kids and how and engage their interest and development. But is it important to parents to get to kids first? Do we need to have, explanations for these questions before this information is sourced elsewhere? Is that important?
Look, I think it's really important. Obviously, there are going to be different cultural and religious perspectives. Every family is different. And I think that's a really important point to make. I think in an ideal world, parents, all adults, would be able to have open and, like I said, age-appropriate conversations with children whenever these things arise. And obviously, the kinds of information you give and the kinds of discussion you're going to have is going to vary so much depending on the child, depending on the age, and the context. But I think being able to talk about consent and, your body being your body, you can have those conversations very early with kids. And I know that it's encouraged at preschools, that's really important for trying to mitigate the kinds of, risk for abuse or for exploitative behaviour from adults and from other children. So, that's all part of sex education. In terms of the, the birds and the bees, exact kind of anatomical talks, they can happen very gradually over time. And that's what I've been trying to do with my 5 and 7-year-old, is to not, I just really don't want to close the conversation down and say, I don't want to talk about that, because I want them to be able to come to me with questions. And I'll try to answer them in as best way as I can at the time. But I want to be a safe person for them to be able to come to with questions. So that would be my answer, even though it's certainly not definite with age.
Yes.
Parents know their kids, and they will know what they need at the different times, ideally. You know,
how graphic should you be? I'm guessing, you know, when two people love each other, you know, they get married and you know, and they decide to have a baby. That sort of, you know, broad brush, grandmothery statement type stuff is going to wear pretty thin. And I imagine it's, as we know, with the exposure to information that our kids have, it's probably wearing thin pretty quickly these days. So, how graphic do you need to be?
Look, there's a couple of different ways to answer that question. I think it's really good to be led by the child and what they're asking. So most of the time they won't be asking for the graphic detail. But if they do ask, then I think it's important to give a clear answer that, you know, is as direct as possible, and to talk about, but that's really when you need to talk about, you know, consent, or saying, like, you know, this happens if this person wants it and if you want it, and all of those sorts of things. But those conversations probably won't happen until, you know, older than my kids. I haven't had that conversation yet. They're 5 and 7. But, you know, they have been curious about where babies come from and those things. So I've just sort of given little bits of information. But also, it has to be said from the research, and I haven't got to this yet as a parent, most people, if you interview teenagers or young people about it, will say that the information they got about, you know, their anatomical stuff was not from their parents. They got it from pornography, or they were told by someone at school, and that they wished that you know, perhaps their parents were the ones to tell them first, or so they could have that conversation, and it can save a lot of confusion. So there is an argument for being, I guess, ready for those conversations. And to be honest, I think this is where these kind of books can come in.
Yeah.
Because, you know, most of us, very few of us are sex education researchers or specialists, and just have all of this research and information at hand. That's why these books exist, right? So that we can use a kind of accessible, age-appropriate tool to support our conversations instead of having to reinvent the wheel as parents. So I think schools also have a role to play in providing a very basic kind of framework for sex and relationships education.
But gee, that's hard, isn't it? Because you'd be conscious of stepping it. You mentioned cultural and family differences in regard to that. You wouldn't want to upset someone, would you? Or upset a family member, I mean, you know, have a parent worrying about what you're saying in the school environment.
Of course, of course you wouldn't. But also, because it's really important that every child does have access to sexuality education. It is part of the curriculum, and it really needs to be, because, you know, school is that levelling place where people will receive the same information, and as a society that's really important. So the level of detail, or the kinds of things that you want to talk to your kids about or don't want to talk to your kids about, is absolutely a parent's right. So, you know, parents can decide whether they want to talk about gender diversity and things like that. That kind of thing isn't, I think, really taught yet in schools. I think it should be, because it's a part of life, and it's a part of young people's lives. You know, they're already talking about it. They're already becoming aware of it and educating us a lot of the time. So I think it's important to respect people's rights, and certainly there are differences from all kinds of perspectives, but I think it's also really important to acknowledge the rights of everybody in this space.
Can we talk about the broader social context? Because I imagine if you're breaking up this conversation, so little kids, you might start with some sort of understanding of the body, you know, so that they know what their body does, and, you know, some broad understanding of the various functions of the bits, you know, the bits and pieces. And then, of course, when you get into the physical act of procreation and you know, baby making, you could be more detailed at an appropriate time. But what about the broader implications of managing that process? You know, how do we make sure that we're creating great young men, for example, and how important is timely sex education as part of that?
Oh, it's so important. Good sex education or sexuality education should always include a huge amount about respectful relationships. The curriculum that's developed and is deployed and used in Victoria, respectful relationships education, focuses on, you know, the role of gender here, and the role of gender roles for men and women, and for how, consent and respect needs to be at the centre of those discussions. And that filters through to so many different aspects of life, right? So if we're looking at all of, we're having discussions about consent, obviously very publicly in the last few years. We've also been having lots of very public discussions about gender-based violence and how prevalent that is in our society. So all of these discussions, I think, can be had from a very early age, again, in an age-appropriate way, around respecting other people's bodies, not touching other people without asking them, and adults have a lot to learn in this space too with children, but I think the discussion is moving forward. There's the more recent consent ads that the government is running in New South Wales around, the first time someone says don't hit, the first time you say, all those sorts of quite subtle messages. They are about consent, they are about respect, and they will ultimately lead to better relationships across the spectrum of gender.
Julia, just in regard to the broader gender issue, that's been a thorn in the side of many who've bought into this latest discussion, of course, from a conservative perspective, when children should have their horizons broadened in regard to what's being discussed a lot these days, of course. And given that there's so much discussion about gender and non-binary humans, how early does that have to be part of the conversation? Because that's a very contentious issue as well, isn't it?
I think for people of older generations, my generation included, so I was born in the 80s, this is a new conversation. It's something that we need to learn about as well, instead of just assuming we have all the answers because, it's like that for our parents and so forth. So it really depends, again, on the child and on the environment. Many young people now are going to school with non-binary young people in their classes, and from preschool onwards, it really is a part of our society and it's up to us, I think, to be educated about that and to be open to learning about that and to be led by the families and the young people who are non-binary or transgender themselves. They will have the answers for how they would like to be addressed. They will tell you which pronouns they would like to use, and I think it's really important, to listen, because this is certainly, something that is growing and is not going to go away. It's something that's always been there as well. So I think the kinds of levels of discrimination we're seeing are really unhelpful and are really harmful to young people who are already really struggling in this space due to discrimination. So I think it will ultimately lead to better discussions around gender and sexuality, but we're in a bit of a difficult phase of it at the moment, which I think is really concerning and really difficult for those young people and their families.
And some people suggest that these kinds of publications and access to this kind of information too early is going to create some sort of gender dysphoria. There's no evidence for that, is there? I mean, it's important to engage with those who would place themselves other than on the poles of the spectrum. It's important to engage with them at the appropriate time. You're not going to in any way corrupt their development, are you?
Oh, absolutely not. No, absolutely not. I think that's something that is often said, but there's really no evidence for it. And it's like anything. As societies change and become and progress and become more tolerant, then it enables a more diverse range of identities and perspectives to be visible. I mean, these young people would have felt this way or would have, often not been able to identify. I think about my high school, and I went to a Catholic high school in Victoria. No one was gay. It wasn't safe, right? It didn't mean that no one was gay. It wasn't safe to be gay. It wasn't safe to be not heterosexual. And I think it hasn't been safe to be non-binary. It hasn't been safe to be trans before, and it still obviously isn't when you see the timbre of discussions and the level of abuse that, even Big W staff had to suffer around this book. So I think we've got a long way to go, and I think ultimately things will improve for young people who have more diverse genders and sexualities, and also diversity across society more broadly from a range of cultural perspectives.
Fascinating discussion, Julia. I appreciate you coming on and chatting with us today. Thank you.
My pleasure, Paul. Thank you.